Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Candelia Jackson, the Northwest Regional Consultant with Elder Abuse Ontario. Before we begin, I'd just like to point out that my colleague Josée Miljour is not joining me today. She had some family obligations she had to attend to. So I am on my own today. So because of that, I have done a pre-recording. I am still present live to answer any questions. I've just done a pre-recording to ensure that there are no technical issues and to make sure I can answer any questions that come up in the chat, because generally I miss those if I'm talking. So I did pre-record this morning, so hopefully this goes well. I just wanted to share that I am speaking to you from Thunder Bay, and I will be talking to you briefly first about elder abuse in general, and then I'll talk specifically about our emotional abuse module. But before we move into the presentation, I would first like to review some of our logistics and would like to thank all of you for taking the time to listen in today and to acknowledge that your interest in this topic already shows a commitment toward recognizing and preventing abuse of older adults. I also want to acknowledge that based on the registration, it looks like almost more than half of you, this is your first time attending an Elder Abuse Ontario webinar. And so for those of you who have attended before, I do apologize. The first part is repetitive. You have heard it before. It is the brief overview of Elder Abuse Ontario, as well as elder abuse in general. But because we have more than half present who have never attended a webinar with us before, I think it's important that we first talk a bit about what elder abuse in general is. So some of the logistics first is that all of you are muted during the webinar. The session is being recorded and it will be posted on our website afterwards, along with the PDF of the presentation. Again, if you're experiencing any issues, just please type into the chat box. It does come up as Mary Mead, but it is myself, Candelia Jackson, who is responding. And I'm going to try and keep about 10 or 15 minutes at the end of the presentation for any questions or answers that any of you may have. And then at the end of the presentation, you will be prompted to fill out an evaluation form. If you don't mind, it would be great if you could take some time to fill it out, as it does help us guide for future presentations and gives us some good feedback around what's missing or what we could do differently. And again, my contact information will also be provided at the end of the presentation if you have any questions. So some of our learning objectives today are to know where to access Elder Abuse Ontario resources online, specifically our learning modules, develop a general understanding of elder abuse and ageism, become aware of current legislation, and understand how to support older adults experiencing emotional abuse. So just a bit about our organization first. So we are a not-for-profit charitable organization with a head office located in Toronto. We were established in 1992 and we are funded by the province of Ontario under the Ministry of Seniors and Accessibility. Even though we are funded by the province, I'd like to point out that the views and opinions you hear today are not necessarily those of the province. We do have a mission to create an Ontario where all seniors are free from abuse through awareness, education, training, collaboration, service coordination, and advocacy. We also oversee the implementation of the Ontario strategy to combat elder abuse. So this strategy has three pillars, looking at community coordination, response, training, and public awareness. It was a strategy that was launched in March 2002 to create awareness and protect vulnerable seniors from harm. It was a $4.3 million strategy developed with advice from the private and public sectors through a roundtable on elder abuse. It was the Ontario Senior Secretariat, the Ministry of Attorney General, and Elder Abuse Ontario all became partners on this strategy, and all three of these pillars were developed as an initiative. So under the coordination of community services, one of our goals is to strengthen communities across the province by building partnerships, promoting information sharing, and supporting local efforts. Then we do some capacity of frontline staff, so developing and offering specialized training for frontline staff that builds on what's already out there to recognize and respond to elder abuse. And then just general public education, so with the goal of increasing awareness of elder abuse as a social justice issue, as a very serious community problem. And Elder Abuse Ontario does have regional consultants all across Ontario. There are 7 of us. Again, I'm the person located here in Thunder Bay, but we also have I have colleagues in Sudbury, Toronto, Peterborough, and Ottawa. We have 2 Francophone consultants, one in Sudbury and one in Ottawa. And we provide we act as key resources for providing consultation on elder abuse cases to review options and resources for intervention. And so this does mean we do not act as case managers on elder abuse cases, but instead we refer people to appropriate community resources that can help support and respond to situations of elder abuse. We also support over 40 local elder abuse committees and networks across the province, and we strengthen partnerships between these committees and other health and social service agencies to enhance the response to elder abuse. And then also we develop and implement training materials, tools, and resources for elder abuse prevention and intervention. Okay, so let's talk a bit about ageism before we move into talking a bit about elder abuse in general. We know the Ontario Human Rights Commission notes that abuse of older adults occurs largely in part due to negative attitudes towards older adults and their economic or social vulnerability. And we know that abuse can be linked to stereotypes of aging. So for example, authority figures may not believe an older adult when they say they have been taken advantage of or abused because they have misconceptions about their capacity. And these perceptions and misconceptions about aging really do contribute to the prevalence of elder abuse. So I think it's important that people of all ages be better informed about aging and end the rights of older adults. And we know that ageism happens when we make up our mind about what a group of people are like because of their age. And I would say in general, most of us do have ageist attitudes. So if we've ever heard ourselves say things like kids spend too much time on computers, or we follow behind a slow driver and thought, that person must be an old person. So these are just a few examples of ageism, because they make a general statement about either all young people or all older adults that can't possibly be true. So anytime we hear ourselves saying things like those people or they always, it's generally rooted in this type of ageism. And we know that when we have this sort of thinking, it's what leads to the stereotypes. So we might hear ourselves saying things like, all older adults are slow and boring, are mentally incompetent, they think they know everything, they don't have sexual feelings, they burden the healthcare system, live in old age homes, are cranky, are wise, are angels, are bad drivers. And again, this isn't an exhaustive list, but it is examples of how our attitudes and beliefs can create stereotypes. And these stereotypes can also lead to what are the ageist behaviors. So it's where our stereotypes create behaviors that make us treat older adults differently. So treating older people like children. We may feel entitled to older parents' time, money, and assets, not including them because they wouldn't understand or are too old to learn. Labeling older adults as the aged or elderly as if they are all the same. Calling strangers sweetie and dear because they are older. And what we know is that ageism is the most socially tolerated form of social prejudice. So while we know that other types of oppression definitely continue to exist, and there's a lot of growth and work we need to do to improve breaking down these types of oppression like racism, homophobia, ableism, I would say that in general, when we're at a dinner table conversation and someone makes either a racist or homophobic comment, in general, people are more likely to challenge back or have a retort. Not always, unfortunately. But when it comes to ageism, we still have a lot of work to do. It's really a lot of jokes happen freely without recognizing the impact. And so I really do think it is one of the most socially tolerated forms of social prejudice. And what we know is that 6 in 10 seniors say they've been treated differently because of their age. 8 in 10 agree seniors are seen as less important, and 1 in 5 see older Canadians as a burden. And so over the course of the research our organization has done and other organizations have done around elder abuse, we've heard many stories of adult children who start to make decisions for their parents because they want to help or feel a sense of urgency to solve what they define as problems for their parents. And I think unless there's a clear safety issue or diminishing mental capacity, the older adult has the right to choose and make their life decisions. So even if there are capacity issues, the older adult's wishes really should be heard and respected, even if they cannot be accommodated. And I think ageist assumptions really run far and wide in our society about what it means to be older. So many people unconsciously or even consciously link aging to becoming dependent, weak, and less important. And I think all Canadians need to become more aware of how and when we treat people as if they have less value because of their age. And we see this often in our work when we receive case consultations where well-meaning, sometimes family members may be pushing their parent or loved one to do things they're not ready to do, such as leaving their home, so not being able to age in place if they're still wanting to, but family sometimes is pushing them not to remain in their own homes. Again, often well-meaning, but not necessarily what the person is wanting. Okay, so let's talk a bit about elder abuse before we move into our conversation about emotional abuse. First, I think it's important to note that elder abuse lags about 40 years behind child abuse research and 20 years behind domestic violence research. Research on family violence most often focuses on child abuse and intimate partner violence, whereas the mistreatment of older adults, or also known as elder abuse and neglect, has been a very neglected area of focus. I myself personally have worked in the field of human rights education before joining Elder Abuse Ontario, and it really is my strong belief that one of the biggest human rights challenges facing all of us is the need to better protect the right of older adults. I think older adults and elder abuse should be a matter of concern to all of us as sons, as daughters, as people who one day ourselves require care and assistance for others. And really just as members of a cohesive and caring community, I think it's a topic that impacts us all. It is a very complex topic. It intersects with many other kinds of violence, discrimination, and abuse. We know racism, homophobia, ageism, ableism, they do not end just because someone gets older. So therefore, although we'll be talking specifically about the emotional abuse of older adults today, I think it's also important to acknowledge that someone may be navigating many other kinds of oppression in their lives. And I think it's our responsibility, particularly as service providers, to recognize the complexities that might be present and to find holistic types of interventions. So let's first define elder abuse. So Elder Abuse Ontario uses the World Health Organization definition, which defines elder abuse as a single or repeated act or lack of appropriate actions occurring in any relationship where there is an expectation of trust that causes harm or distress to an older person. So despite what many may think, elder abuse is more than hitting a person. It's very multifaceted, very complex, and it encompasses a broad range of behaviors, events, and circumstances. I think it's a really we need to point out that an abusive relationship is different from situations where two people are in conflict with each other. In a conflict, people may do things to hurt each other. They may call each other names, and fights can sometimes escalate. However, both people have power in the relationship. So one person does not necessarily live in fear of the other. Their rights and freedoms are not oppressed. So if both people are able to make choices about what happens next, people may need support and help in these situations, but they are not necessarily being abused in the way we are focusing on in this presentation, where abusive tactics are being used by one person deliberately or even unintentionally to exert or maintain power over another person in a way that controls their movements and choices. So at Elder Abuse Ontario, we do have various learning modules available that are all free for download on our website. And each of those modules look specifically at physical abuse, sexual abuse, psychological, financial neglect. We do not have one on systemic, but I do think it's one that's important to acknowledge is a very prevalent concern in society, but and something we try and interweave throughout all of our modules. But if we're to look at all of these, the most prevalent type of abuse is actually psychological and emotional. So the topic we're talking about today, there was a study done in 2014 and 15 by the National Initiative for the Care of the Elderly. They conducted a national telephone survey to to approximately, I think it was 8,163 older Canadians. And based on the results of the study, it did show that psychological was the most prevalent, which I don't think is much of a surprise because oftentimes psychological abuse is very present in the other types of abuse. So physical abuse, neglect, sexual, financial, psychological abuse is often interwoven between those other types of abuse. Followed by psychological was financial abuse. And again, we do have a module and recorded webinar available on our website if anyone's interested in hearing more about financial abuse. I just want to point out, actually, before I move to the next slide, that I personally was interested in how low neglect was on the scale. And so, and often because when I do presentations, particularly with older adults, it is the one I hear often quoted as the one they feel is the most prevalent. And so the study that was done by the National Initiative for the Care of the Elderly is available online. And so I did access it and had a chance to read it. And it's quite interesting that the researchers themselves recognize that self-neglect, that neglect in general was very difficult to measure, particularly self-neglect or unintentional neglect. So for this reason, intentional neglect was what was measured in the study. So it'd be interesting to see how much higher that would be if they were able to better measure for self-neglect and unintentional neglect. So who is at risk of abuse? I think there's a stereotype that abuse of older adults only happens to dependent, frail, elderly people. And we really know this is a myth. I've done some previous work in the past around gender-based violence, and many of us who work in violence prevention field know that abuse can happen to anyone at any age, any stage of life. It can happen to capable, fully functioning older adults. And I think people are usually ashamed to find themselves in an abusive situation. They may ask themselves questions like, how did this happen to me? How did I get here? And it's really important that we emphasize that abuse is never the fault of the person being abused. We also know that there are why some people are more at risk of abuse. So we do know that living with depression or other mental health challenges may place someone more at risk of abuse. Previous abuse as a youth or adult may place someone more at risk of abuse. And this is because the abuse may be normalized. The older adult may feel like it's not as bad as it was when they were younger. So they may not recognize the signs, or again, may normalize the abuse. And being female places someone more at risk as well. And I think it's also important to note that older adults are often thought of as one homogenous group, defined only by their age. And at Elder Abuse Ontario, we recognize that older adults are a diverse group, and that acknowledging this is really critical in preventing and or responding to elder abuse. And as a community, we need to acknowledge that in addition to ageism and elder abuse, someone may be experiencing other forms of oppression in their lives. So we know, for example, the complexity and evident intersections with other forms of violence, abuse, and discrimination, like I mentioned previously, racism, homophobia, ageism, ableism. These do not end, again, just because someone gets older. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge the profound impacts of past trauma and past experiences or current experiences of oppression. So specifically, we know that members of the LGBTQ2S plus community, so lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, two-spirited, and plus meaning to be inclusive for all other identities that are not recognized in this acronym. So these seniors may face social discrimination due to their age as well as their sexual orientation or gender identity. This may show up, for example, when someone has been safely out in their community but now finds themselves in long-term care, where they may feel like they have to hide their identity all over again and are not receiving support either from staff or experiencing discrimination from residents. We know the ongoing legacy of residential schools and colonization places Indigenous folks more at risk. And we know women with disabilities are 4 times more likely to be sexually assaulted. So again, we know the impacts of trauma on the brain and body can really be severe, pervasive, and long-lasting. We know that when someone feels safe, it facilitates general health and well-being. It releases beneficial hormones, helps learning, critical thinking, and productivity. It makes life more enjoyable, increases connections, people like you more, improves relationships, allows bodily functions to operate, optimizes the overall human experience. And we really are wired to be social beings. So when feelings of safety are removed, it makes the person more vulnerable to either experiencing abuse or even inflicting it. And I think that I just want to point out that even though many of us are learning that caring relationships are one of the biggest factors in helping people cope with trauma. So we know that just as traumatic experiences can alter a life in an instant, so too can a therapeutic encounter. So I think understanding how trauma and violence work is an important step in understanding how to respond to abuse. So again, when feelings of safety are removed, it does make the person more vulnerable to experiencing the abuse or inflicting it. And I don't think this is an excuse for inflicting abuse, but it does help us understand a bit more why someone may engage in abusive behaviors. Which is when we talk about who does behave abusively towards older adults. We know it's most often family members such as adult children or grandchildren. In long-term care or retirement homes, it could be resident-to-resident abuse is common. And people who behave abusively are also other relatives or friends, paid or unpaid caregivers, landlords, financial advisors, or anyone in a position of power, authority, or trust. So moving specifically to talking about emotional abuse, again, this module is all available on our website. It's meant to be a guide for service providers and caregivers in helping to prevent and respond to emotional abuse in older adults. And within the module, there are guiding principles, there's overviews and definitions, risk factors and warning signs, there's some assessment questions, there's some interview strategies, safety planning, case studies, discussion questions. I won't be going through every single element of the module, but I will be touching on areas that are important to outline through the webinar. But again, each of the areas are available on our website if you're interested in bringing them to group meetings, looking at the case studies, using our decision tree to go through and navigate how you would support and intervene. So first, just defining emotional abuse. So emotional abuse is any action, verbal or nonverbal, that lessens a person's sense of dignity, their identity and self-worth. Emotional abuse includes any attempt to demoralize, dehumanize, or intimidate older adults. So this could include name-calling, ridiculing, insulting, bullying, neglect, controlling, so not allowing the older adult to socialize, or including limited access to telephone friends or attending social gatherings. It could include threats of violence or abandonment. It may also include blaming the older adult for abusive behavior. We also know that emotional abuse is often interchanged with a variety of terms, including psychological abuse, mental cruelty, verbal abuse, and psychological aggression. But for the purpose of this module, the term emotional abuse is what's used. We also know that emotional abuse can be identified as either a consequence of other forms of abuse, particularly physical or sexual abuse, and it can also be a separate and distinct form of abuse. And so when identifying emotional abuse, I think we must consider cultural values, beliefs, family dynamics, intergenerational relationships, social norms, and an individual's acceptance levels of harm and abuse. So our societal attitudes may contribute and even condone the abuse of older adults or the beliefs that is acceptable, allowing it to continue without detection or intervention. So these attitudes include discrimination, the lack of respect for older adults, and the belief that what goes on in a home is private or sort of a family matter. Perspectives of abuse also vary across diverse cultural, ethnic, and religious communities. So it's important not to ignore signs of abuse by attributing the behaviors to cultural differences. So some of the characteristics of the abuser might be someone who's dependent for money, food, housing, transportation. They may be living with a substance abuse or addiction, poor physical and or mental health conditions, They may have prejudice or ageist attitudes, lack of understanding of the aging process. Caregiving assumed out of resignation or obligation. So they themselves, that's a situation I feel I navigated recently here in Thunder Bay, is very well-meaning family members were meant to be caring for an aging mother, and unfortunately the person providing the care was a mom with 5 children, a full-time job, and was feeling quite resentful that she was the only sibling here in Thunder Bay. The rest of her siblings are in other parts of the country, and so was feeling a bit resentful about having to provide care for her mom, and I think was had a bit of caregiver burden in a lot of ways, and so because of that was neglecting some of the emotional needs of her mom. There have since been some really positive interventions, and I think this mom just needed a bit more support, but a lot of times we do see abuse happen when caregiving, again, is assumed out of resignation or obligation. So what do we, when we're recognizing signs of abuse, so signs may indicate that an older adult is or has experienced emotional abuse, could include changes in their normal routines, behaviors, as well as their mental health. So it could be unexplained or uncharacteristic changes in behavior, may also be mistaken for memory loss or illness, when really they are the effects of stress or worrying resulting from emotional abuse that the older adult is experiencing. So we might see fear, discomfort, or nervousness around family members, unusual withdrawal from family and friends, unexplained feelings of helplessness, hopelessness or anxiety, heightened levels of upset or agitation, and reluctance to talk openly. They may wait for the caregiver to respond to questions asked of them. And again, some of the behavioral signs that we might also see could be the person might appear tired or stressed. They may seem, sorry, these are some of the behavioral signs of a caregiver who may be potentially doing the abuse. They themselves may appear tired or stressed. They may seem excessively concerned or unconcerned. They may blame the older adult for acts such as incontinence. They may behave aggressively toward the person. They may themselves have a history of substance abuse or of abusing others. They do not want the person to be interviewed alone, which is one reason why we really encourage trying to find ways to always have at least a bit of time alone with the older adult if you have concerns, to ask them questions. They may respond defensively when questioned, or maybe hostile or evasive. And they may be providing care to the older adult for very long periods of time, and may be tired themselves. So some of the barriers to reporting. So some of the barriers to reporting that we might see are fear of retaliation. So this could be heightened by geographic isolation. So I see this a lot here in Northern Ontario, where if someone's their geographic isolation is from police and social services, so a perpetrator or his or her family may hear about the abuse before the authorities respond, so placing the victim or survivor at greater risk. A sense of dependence on family members, feelings of hopelessness and powerlessness. There may be literacy level challenges, intergenerational trauma. There could also be shame. So some older adults carry shame for the harm they inflicted on their loved ones and see their exploitation or neglect or abuse as payback. We also know that older adults may desire to protect the loved ones who are hurting them. They may be afraid about starting gossip in their family or community, or being characterized as a victim. Terror may also keep the older adult from reporting. So older victims or survivors may believe if they tell someone about the abuse, they will be institutionalized or abandoned. So again, this is something I see sometimes here in Northern Ontario, where some of our more remote communities that do not have access to long-term care, things like that, someone may feel that if they disclose abuse, they may be institutionalized. Specifically, if it's someone from an Indigenous community, that this may increase fears of re-traumatization, fearing that long-term care may have similar experiences if the person has been a survivor of residential school. And so again, this feeling of reporting and the the complexities of living in isolation. So again, many older adults may worry about the loss of independence or being sent to live outside their community. And additionally, a person may be unable to report abuse due to a lack of mental capacity, physical limitations, or extreme isolation. So one of the things that we really want to encourage and stress the importance of is one of the most important things we can do about responding in situations of elder abuse is we want to reduce and eliminate isolation. We know that isolation is one of the largest contributing factors to elder abuse, and the more abuse happens, oftentimes the more isolated the person becomes. So reducing or eliminating isolation is where we want to place a lot of our energy and focus. And we know that service providers really are key to identifying abuse. So frontline workers are able to detect and intervene in cases of abuse. They develop an ongoing relationship with the older adult. You can speak with the senior about the suspected abuse, help facilitate early identification or prevention, help reduce the isolation experienced by older adults, ask questions about potential abuse, discuss options for service and action. We think of assessment role. As the situation becomes better understood, it's important to obtain more specific signs of potential abuse. So this could involve both dialogue and observation, an ongoing process. It may take many visits. Being sensitive to language, cultural differences, and keeping in mind one's own values can influence perceptions of the situation, and always clarify any uncertainties with the older adult themselves. I also want to acknowledge that I think having a trauma-informed, not just a trauma-informed approach, but a trauma and violence-informed approach is really important in terms of responding to situations of elder abuse and abuse in general. So trauma-informed care seeks to create safe environments for clients on understanding the effects of trauma and links to healthcare. But we know that trauma and violence-informed care expands this concept to account for intersecting effects of systemic and interpersonal violence. A lot of this material is taken from Equip Healthcare Canada. I've provided the link below because I do think that the material they've provided is extremely useful in expanding our knowledge around using a trauma and violence-informed approach to responding to situations of abuse. And we know that some of the trauma and violence-informed universal precautions are that most people have experienced some form of trauma, knowing that disclosure is not necessary, creating a caring care, safety. The organization is responsible to create a culture of safety. So really shifting the focus from what's wrong with you to what happened to you is really something that's important at both the organizational and individual level. And so Equip has provided some tools and suggestions for ways to work in a trauma and violence informed way. One of them they talk about is building awareness and understanding. So talking about how all services taking a trauma and violence informed approach begin with building awareness among staff and clients of things like high prevalence of trauma and violence, the significance of historical, so collective and individual and ongoing violence, how the impacts of trauma can be central to one's development, the relationship of trauma and violence with substance abuse, physical health, and mental health. And two, emphasizing safety and trust. So knowing it's not necessary to know an individual's history of trauma or violence in order to provide this type of care, but that everyone should receive respectful and safe care. So creating welcoming environments and intake procedures, adapting the physical space for comfort, private interactions, helping create crisis and safety plans, understanding the history and context of individuals and groups and communities, thinking of these strategies as universal precautions to ensure that all clients and patients, whether they have experienced trauma, violence or not, are not re-traumatized or harmed. And adapting our language. So I really love this slide. It really speaks to me strongly because I still hear this a lot in many service providing organizations, that instead of using language like a battered woman or abuser or at risk, we're using just things like a man, woman, people. Instead of non-compliant patients, we're instead using unsuitable care, or instead of she doesn't want help, our help isn't meeting her needs. and really considering trauma as a risk factor. Anyone who's aware of the ACE studies, so the Adverse Childhood Experiences studies, if you're not aware, I really encourage you to look up. It's called the ACE study. So I can't remember exactly the year it was done. It was done quite a few years ago. I think maybe in the 90s, 80s or 90s. But it's an interesting research that was done around the adverse childhood experiences and how those experiences really can impact our development even as adults. So it can create disrupted neurodevelopment, social, emotional, and cognitive impairments, adaptation and health risk factors. And so experiences of interpersonal violence, racism, discrimination can change neurobiological patterns and genetic structures that affect mental and physical health. However, as I mentioned before, this is why I think it's really important to know that there's also really incredible studies. There's a great researcher named Bruce Perry. He's written a book called, I believe it's called Boy Raised by Dogs. One of a really profound book that shifted a lot around how I think about the brain and trauma, and I encourage people to access it as well. But a lot of the studies really emphasize as well that despite the impacts of trauma on our brain, that those close, therapeutic, lasting relationships also have really long-term positive impacts on people. And this includes on older adults who've had adverse childhood experiences and are currently experiencing trauma in their lives as well. So again, just moving on, so some of the sample questions we can consider using when we're interacting with an older adult are things like, is there anyone close to you that makes you feel uncomfortable? Is there anyone that you fear being left alone with? Are you afraid of family members and or caregivers? How do family members behave towards you? Are they verbally abusive? Do your caregivers and or family members always answer questions that are asked of you? Can you tell me about a time recently when someone talked to you or yelled at you in a way that made you feel bad about yourself? Does anyone ever scold or threaten you? Can you give me an example? Does anyone ever tell you that you're sick when you know you are not? Can you give me an example? When was the last time you were able to see relatives or friends? Do you have any access to a telephone? If not, why not? Are you by yourself a lot? And so we can use these questions for an older adult living in a long-term care retirement home. Some sample questions could be, does the person have a limited social network? Is the resident isolated? Has anyone yelled, insulted, or made the resident feel bad about themselves? Does the resident feel afraid of anyone in particular? Is the person withdrawing from participating in activities or socializing? Does the person have any serious illnesses or physical impairments? Then does the person have any cognitive impairments? And so some of the questions also that are available in our module are questions that you can ask to the suspected abuser. So are you, using the older adult's names, aware of the kinds of help available in the community? How do you and the person handle disagreements? What expectations does this person have of you? Most caregivers find their role stressful. I sense caring for the person's name is stressful for you. Is this recent, or has this been this way for some time? So really creating also that supportive environment for the person, because what we do know is that in most cases of abuse towards older adults, particularly in situations of emotional abuse, the abuse is very complex. It's very, subtle micro types of abuse that may not always, but may be contributed to stressors that the abuser is also experiencing. So thinking about sort of compassionate responses, holistic responses, where we're recognizing that the abuser themselves may also be unintentionally abusing, and they themselves may benefit from some supports and increased services to help them provide better care and support to their loved one. Again, here's some additional slides that are available with formulating different questions. I'm not going to go through them specifically because they are available on our module, but again, just a few. So emphasizing, do you feel able to ask for help from the other person when you feel you need a break? Does the person need help with everyday things? Yeah. So I do want to touch a bit now on mandatory reporting. And so I think it's important to know that despite the absence of any federal mandatory reporting of elder abuse, some Canadian provinces have adopted provincial mandatory reporting laws. So some provinces such as Nova Scotia have adopted forms of adult protection legislation that call for the mandatory reporting of the abuse of elderly and other vulnerable adults. But most other provinces and territories, with some exceptions, only require by law or government policy the mandatory reporting of the abuse of residents in nursing homes or so long-term care retirement homes. Within the community setting, that mandatory reporting is not present. So again, just to emphasize, elder abuse responses really do vary considerably within across Ontario and within regions in Ontario. So because older adults do not usually self-report incidents of abuse, the responsibility for identification, reporting, and intervention really rests largely with healthcare professionals, social service agencies, and other police departments. So if the person, again, is in long-term care or retirement home, so Section 24 of the Long-Term Care Health Act states that anyone who sees or suspects abuse in long-term care is legally obligated to report it immediately to the director, and similar obligations are required in retirement homes as well. So the duty to report in these spaces is placed on anyone with reasonable grounds who suspects abuse may or may has occurred. This includes staff, doctors, social workers, regulated practitioners, and only residents are excluded or can report but are not required to. I do want to just emphasize, actually, before I jump to the next slide, that again, in Ontario, if anyone is living within a community setting, so is not in long-term care or retirement home, it really is up to the older adult themselves if they want to report abuse. It's sort of the right to live at risk. As adults, we all have the right to live at risk, recognizing the complexity of that statement. But it really is the decision of the person experiencing the abuse who's living in the community to report or not report abuse, which is why I think it's important as service providers that we maintain relationships, keep checking in, asking the person, are you safe today? And if they say yes, keep asking it tomorrow. Are you safe? Are you safe today? Are you safe today? Each day, because if with that trust, one day they may feel safe disclosing that they're not and may feel ready to report. So I think maintaining that relationship so the person until the person is, or if they're ever ready to report, at least they know they have someone to turn to for support if they need it. So just acknowledging, is emotional abuse a criminal offense? So in Canada, certain forms of elder abuse are considered crimes under the Canadian Criminal Code of Canada. And so elder abuse is not a separate offense, but some abusive of actions are covered by the code. So although all forms of abuse are wrong, not all actions or tactics used by perpetrators toward an older adult, such as insulting, isolating, and ignoring behaviors, are necessarily recognized as a crime. They can be signs that the abuse might be getting worse in the future, but they're not necessarily a crime. But there are here are some of the criminal code provisions that may apply in cases of emotional abuse. So we know that assault could be a specific example that applies. So it could be committed by attempting or threatening to apply force to another person if the other person believes that the abuser has the ability to carry out the act. It could be uttering threats. So when someone knowingly utters or conveys a threat to cause death or bodily harm to another person. And then criminal harassment. So to be criminal, this behavior must be overtly threatening or must happen repeatedly or must have been made the person fear for his or her personal safety. So just to conclude, this is one of my last slides here. For any of you who are not familiar with an organization in the United States called the Frameworks Institute, they're a nonprofit organization does a lot of work and research around framing public discourse on various social issues. So what they do is they map the gap between public discourse and expert knowledge on various issues. I again highly encourage people to visit their website. They have some really incredible tools and resources on a wide range of topics, whether it be from addictions, mental health, a very wide range of topics. And so they recently did some work around elder abuse. And in 2017, they published a great tool around reframing elder abuse as a social justice issue. So really talking about how in the community, when we start talking about elder abuse, we need to frame it as a social justice issue. And in their study and in their research, they saw that the general public view aging as a process of deterioration, decline, and increasing dependency, and that people consistently treat older people as objects to be cared for. That really stands out for me. So treating older people as objects to be cared for. So really not humanizing, they're really dehumanizing the older adult. I just want to emphasize, they really, in this study, they talked about how the general public see older adults as objects to be cared for and protected rather than as people to be empowered and engaged. So they acknowledge that while experts acknowledge that older adults could include distinctive vulnerabilities, they emphasize that aging is different for different people and is influenced by a whole wide variety of social factors. But moreover, they do not equate aging with decline. So in their resources and tools that you can access, they really talk about how combating elder abuse requires treating older people as equals in society rather than as objects of care. I really love that, and I encourage you to visit their website as well. So just to conclude, I always like to end with the last slide of, if you were being abused, how would you want to be treated? I think that we must ask these difficult questions to start the conversation. I think elder abuse is regrettably indicative of social attitudes which really reflect a lack of respect or recognition of older persons as full participants in the community. And I think it really is unacceptable that these forms of abuse persist. But I really believe that widespread cultural change is possible, and I think much of society's work in this area will happen at a grassroots level, undertaken by local health, legal, and social work organizations, and within families. I think that the change will happen because of people like yourselves who are listening in and who care about this topic. So again, I would like to thank all of you for your participation. Let's really start thinking of elder abuse as a social justice issue. And so the last slides here just include some of our provincial resources that are available. Again, this will be available for download on our website. So please note that most of the resources listed here, you can connect with your local centers in your region within Ontario. And these are all the slides here. And so now I am open for questions if anyone has questions. And this concludes the end of the recorded webinar. And so I, again, will be here live. I am here live, so I'm going to end the recording here. And I'm available to answer any questions.